The spring of 1943 arrived at Bletchley Park with the scent of apple blossoms and the weight of accumulated victories that felt more like scars than celebrations. Mavis Beatty, now 22 years old but appearing years older to anyone who looked closely at her eyes, sat in the expanded Hut 6 now supplemented by concrete annexes that lacked even the minimal charm of the original wooden structure and contemplated the strange mathematics of intelligence warfare. In the past 3 years, she had personally decrypted more than 4,000 Italian naval messages. Each decrypt had been rushed to the Admiralty, where operational planners had used the intelligence to route convoys, position submarines, plan attacks, and avoid ambushes. Conservative estimates suggested that her work had directly contributed to saving more than 10,000 Allied merchant vessels from destruction, along with the crews that sailed them and the millions of tons of cargo they carried, 10,000 ships, perhaps 100,000 sailors. An incalculable amount of fuel, ammunition, food, and medical supplies that had reached their destinations instead of sinking to the Mediterranean floor. And yet she could not forget the cost of those achievements: the Italian submarines destroyed, the enemy ships sunk, the convoys interdicted, the thousands of Axis sailors who had drowned because she had been good at her job. The moral calculus of intelligence work offered no easy answers. Only the knowledge that in total war, every choice carried consequences measured in human lives. "You're brooding again." Margaret's voice cut through her reverie, sharp but not unkind. Margaret understood better than most what the work did to those who performed it well. "Guilt is a luxury we can't afford until the war is over. Then you can spend the rest of your life questioning every decision if you want. Right now, we have work to do." The work had indeed intensified. The Italian security improvements that Mavis had detected in January had been implemented gradually throughout the spring, making each decrypt marginally more difficult. But more significantly, the Germans had begun to take over an increasing share of Mediterranean naval operations, bringing with them cipher systems that were even more complex than the Italian naval enigma. The expansion of Bletchley Park had brought new personnel with different specializations. Mathematicians from Cambridge worked on theoretical approaches to breaking German naval enigma. Linguists analyzed message formats and operator habits. Engineers built increasingly sophisticated mechanical aids, the bombs that could test thousands of rotor settings per hour, dramatically accelerating the decryption process. But human insight remained essential. Machines could test possibilities, but only experienced cryptanalysts could recognize the patterns that revealed which possibilities to test. Mavis found herself in a strange role, no longer working primarily on individual decrypts, but instead training others, identifying promising approaches, serving as a consultant on the most difficult problems. The morning of May 7, 1943, brought an intercept that would reshape her understanding of what intelligence work meant and what it cost. The message was German rather than Italian, captured from a submarine communications network in the Mediterranean. It had been partially broken by analysts in Hut 8, the section dedicated to German naval enigma, but contained sections that resisted standard cryptanalytic approaches. Mavis was called in to consult because of her extensive experience with Mediterranean naval traffic and her reputation for seeing patterns that others missed. She studied the partial decrypt for 3 hours, trying different analytical approaches until something clicked into place. The message structure resembled Italian naval formats, suggesting that German operators in the Mediterranean had adapted some Italian procedures. Once she recognized that hybrid approach, the rest of the cipher yielded with surprising speed. The decrypted message was operational orders for a submarine Wolfpack multiple, German and Italian submarines coordinating to attack a major Allied convoy heading from Alexandria to Sicily. The convoy was carrying elements of an infantry division being deployed for the upcoming invasion of Sicily, along with fuel, ammunition, and supplies essential for the campaign. Loss of the convoy would not merely be a tactical setback. It would delay the entire invasion operation, potentially by months. But the message contained something else. Something that made Mavis's hands shake as she read and reread the decrypt to ensure she had understood correctly. The submarines had been specifically ordered to make every effort to rescue survivors if they sank troop ships. The message referenced Geneva Convention obligations regarding prisoners of war and emphasized that survivors should be treated according to international law. It was a jarring reminder that the enemy were not monsters but human beings operating under military orders, constrained by the same laws and ethical frameworks that supposedly governed Allied conduct. The submarines preparing to attack the convoy included crews who would follow through on orders to rescue survivors, who saw themselves as honorable combatants rather than murderers. And Mavis was about to ensure those submarines were destroyed before they could carry out their attack. She sat with the decrypt for a long time, struggling with emotions she could not fully articulate. In 3 years of cryptanalytic work, she had become exceptionally good at compartmentalizing, at treating enemy forces as abstract problems to be solved, rather than as human beings who would die as a consequence of her success. But this message, with its casual reference to rescuing survivors and following international law, had penetrated those psychological defenses. The submarine crews preparing to attack the convoy were not significantly different from British submarine crews preparing to attack Axis convoys. They were following orders. They believed they were serving their country honorably. They would kill Allied sailors if given the opportunity, but they would also try to rescue survivors when possible. They existed in the same moral gray zone that all combatants inhabited in modern industrial warfare. And she was going to send them to die because that was what the invisible war required. Mavis delivered the decrypt to the Naval Intelligence Liaison Officer with mechanical efficiency, her voice steady as she explained the submarine positions, the attack timeline, the force composition. The officer thanked her with the distracted courtesy of someone who receives such briefings multiple times per day, then hurried off to transmit the intelligence to operational commands. Within hours, British anti-submarine forces were repositioning. Aircraft with improving detection equipment were being deployed. The convoy's route was being adjusted based on the intelligence about submarine positions. Everything was proceeding according to the established protocols that had proven so effective over the past 3 years. 3 days later, fragmentary reports indicated that 2 submarines had been sunk by British destroyers near the convoy route, with a third damaged and forced to surface. The convoy had reached Sicily without loss, delivering its cargo of soldiers and supplies on schedule for the invasion preparations. Another success. More lives saved. More enemy combatants killed. The relentless calculus of intelligence warfare continued its grim accounting. That evening, Mavis walked alone through the grounds of Bletchley Park, trying to process the complex emotions that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained psychological defenses. The estate had been transformed by 3 years of war. What had once been an eccentric mansion with a few wooden huts had become a sprawling complex of buildings, annexes, and support facilities. Thousands of people now worked at Bletchley Park in various capacities, turning it into a city dedicated entirely to the invisible war of signals intelligence. But despite the crowds, Mavis felt profoundly alone. The work she did could not be discussed. The knowledge she carried could not be shared. The moral questions that haunted her could not be examined in the light of open conversation. She existed in a bubble of secrecy that separated her from normal human connection, even with Keith, who worked in a different section and could not discuss the specifics of his own assignments. "I know that look." The voice came from behind her, belonging to Dilly Knox, one of the senior cryptanalysts who had been at Bletchley Park since before the war. Knox was elderly and increasingly ill, but his mind remained sharp, and he had developed a reputation for understanding the psychological toll of intelligence work better than most of the administrative staff. "What look?" Mavis asked, though she knew exactly what he meant. "The look of someone who has just been reminded that the enemy are human beings rather than abstractions," Knox said, settling onto a bench with the careful movements of someone managing constant pain. "It never gets easier, that realization. We can't do this work effectively while constantly acknowledging the humanity of the people we're helping to kill. So we build psychological walls, we use euphemisms, we focus on abstract goals rather than concrete consequences. And then something breaks through those walls, and we're forced to remember what we've been trying to forget." He pulled out a pipe and began the ritual of filling and lighting it, his hands steady despite his illness. "I've been breaking code since before most of the current staff were born. I broke Russian Bolshevik ciphers in 1918. I've worked on diplomatic traffic from every major power. And the fundamental truth I've learned is this: we're not breaking codes. We're breaking people's ability to keep secrets. Every message we decrypt represents someone's attempt to communicate privately, and we're violating that privacy in order to gain advantage. That violation has consequences, sometimes deadly ones. If you can't make peace with that reality, you should request a transfer to other war work." Mavis shook her head. "I can't do that. I'm too good at this and there aren't enough people who can do it at all." Requesting a transfer would be abandoning the work that saves allied lives. Then you have to find a way to live with the moral ambiguity, Knox said. You have to accept that you're simultaneously saving lives and taking lives, that you're both hero and villain depending on which perspective you adopt. The work we do here exists in a space beyond conventional morality, in a realm where the normal rules don't quite apply because the stakes are so catastrophically high. He drew on his pipe, exhaling smoke that drifted away in the evening breeze. I've lost count of how many enemy agents have been captured or killed because I broke the codes they used to communicate with their handlers. I've contributed to military operations that killed thousands of enemy soldiers. I've provided intelligence that shaped strategic decisions affecting millions of people. And I've made peace with that by recognizing that the alternative allowing Nazi Germany to win the war would be infinitely worse than any individual deaths required to prevent that outcome. That's consequentialist ethics taken to an extreme, Mavis observed. Yes, it is. And in total war, consequentialism is the only ethical framework that makes sense. We can't afford the luxury of deontological absolutes when the consequence of adhering to those absolutes is the triumph of genocidal fascism. We do terrible things because the alternative is unthinkable. That's the compromise we make, the sin we accept, the guilt we carry. It's not clean, it's not pretty, but it's necessary. He stood up with effort, preparing to return to his work. You'll either make peace with this, or it will destroy you. I hope you choose the former, because you're too valuable to lose to moral paralysis. After Knox departed, Mavis sat alone on the bench as twilight deepened into night. Around her, Bletchley Park continued its round-the-clock operations. Lights glowing from hut windows despite blackout regulations. The machinery of intelligence warfare grinding on without pause. Somewhere in the Mediterranean, survivors from sunken submarines were being pulled from the water by British ships or drowning in the darkness. Their fates determined by decisions made in this place, by work done by people they would never know existed. Knox was right that consequentialist ethics provided the only workable framework for intelligence warfare. But accepting that framework meant accepting responsibility for consequences that extended far beyond individual control. It meant living with the knowledge that success in this work was measured in enemy deaths as surely as in friendly lives saved. Over the following months, as Allied forces invaded Sicily and then mainland Italy, as the Mediterranean campaign shifted from desperate defense to methodical offensive, Mavis continued her work with a kind of grim determination. She trained new cryptanalysts, consulted on difficult problems, maintained her expertise in Italian and German naval communications. The intelligence continued to flow, shaping operations that would have been impossible without foreknowledge of enemy plans. In September of 1943, Italy surrendered unconditionally, removing the Italian Navy from the war and eliminating the primary target of Mavis's cryptanalytic efforts. It should have felt like victory, like the culmination of 3.5 years of exhausting work. Instead, it felt like an ending without resolution, like a story that stopped mid-sentence. The Italian naval enigma that Mavis had spent thousands of hours learning to break was suddenly irrelevant. The expertise she had developed with such pain and effort had been rendered obsolete by political events. She should have been relieved. Instead, she felt oddly bereft, as if she had lost something essential to her identity. They're reassigning Italian section staff to German naval work, Margaret informed her in October. Your skills are transferable. You'll be working on German Mediterranean communications, supporting ongoing operations as we push north through Italy toward Germany itself. It was presented as a simple administrative decision, but Mavis understood the implications. The work would continue. The moral weight would continue. The invisible war would grind on until final victory or final exhaustion, whichever came first. But something had shifted in her understanding during those months of wrestling with the ethical dimensions of intelligence work. She had accepted, finally, that she could not do this work without accepting responsibility for its consequences. She could not save Allied lives without taking enemy lives. She could not operate effectively while constantly acknowledging the full humanity of those she was helping to kill. The psychological compartmentalization was not moral cowardice but necessary survival mechanism. She would continue the work because it was necessary and because she was exceptionally good at it. She would carry the guilt because guilt was appropriate. And she would live with the knowledge that she had been an instrument of death as surely as any bomber, pilot, or submarine commander, though her weapon was mathematics and her battlefield was ciphertext. The winter of 1943 brought the first realistic hope that the war might actually be won. Soviet forces were pushing Germany back on the Eastern Front. Allied bombers were devastating German industrial capacity. Plans were being developed for a cross-channel invasion that would open a third major front in Western Europe. Victory was no longer a desperate fantasy but a strategic possibility. If Allied forces could maintain pressure, and if the intelligence advantage provided by Bletchley Park could be sustained. Mavis worked through that winter with renewed purpose, applying her hard-won expertise to German naval codes, helping to track U-boat positions, contributing to the Battle of the Atlantic that was finally turning in Britain's favor. The work was familiar yet different. The same fundamental techniques applied to new problems. The same moral compromises required by different tactical situations. On a cold February evening in 1944, Keith found her working late in the now nearly deserted Hut 6 Annex. Most of the staff had left for the night, leaving only the skeleton crew that maintained 24-hour operations. He brought her a cup of tea and a sandwich she had forgotten to eat at dinner. "You're going to work yourself to death," he said. A familiar refrain he had repeated countless times over the past 3 years. "Probably," Mavis agreed, accepting the tea gratefully. "But not today. Today I'm just going to work myself to exhaustion, which is entirely different." Keith sat beside her, looking at the papers spread across her desk without trying to read them. Even married couples at Bletchley Park respected the compartmentalization of classified information. "Do you think about what happens after the war? When all of this is finally over?" Mavis considered the question carefully. "Sometimes. But it's difficult to imagine. This work has defined me for so long that I'm not sure who I'll be without it. I'll be bound by the Official Secrets Act for the rest of my life, unable to discuss what I did during the war, unable to claim credit for contributions that might have mattered. I'll have to build a completely new identity based on acceptable fictions about wartime service. We'll build new lives together," Keith said. "Away from ciphers and secrets and the weight of invisible responsibilities. Something normal and peaceful." "I don't know if I remember how to be normal," Mavis admitted. "I'm not sure I was ever normal even before the war. And the things I've done here, the knowledge I carry that doesn't just disappear when peace comes, it stays with me. All those ships that made it through safely, and all those submarines that didn't, all those lives saved and all those deaths caused. That's part of who I am now permanently." They sat together in comfortable silence, two people who had given years of their lives to work that could never be publicly acknowledged, who had carried impossible responsibilities and somehow not been crushed by the weight. Around them, the machinery of Bletchley Park continued its operations. Thousands of people working through the night to maintain the intelligence advantage that was helping to win the war. And in the Mediterranean, where Mavis's work had helped shift the entire strategic balance, Allied ships sailed through waters that had once been deadly, guided by intelligence they could never know existed, protected by secrets they would never learn, survivors of an invisible war fought by people whose names they would never hear. The shadows cast by intelligence work would follow Mavis for the rest of her life. But in that moment, sitting beside her husband in a dimly lit hut full of ciphertexts and calculating machines, she felt something that might have been peace, or at least acceptance. The work continued, the war ground toward its conclusion. And in the silence between the clatter of typewriters and the hum of calculating machines, Mavis Beatty prepared for another day of listening to ghosts, knowing now what that listening cost, and choosing to pay the price anyway because the alternative remained unthinkable.